The gallows had been raised in the market square of Ashcombe before dawn, and by the time the frost lifted from the cobbles, a crowd had gathered thick enough to stop a cart. It was the third week of a cold October, the year the harvest failed twice over, and the woman they had come to see hang was a poacher's widow named Grace Follett, who had taken a hare from Baron Harrowgate's wood to feed a child who was already dead by the time the magistrate signed the warrant. The people of the village did not speak much. They stood in their patched coats and watched the rope, and the Baron watched from his horse at the square's edge, tall and unmoving, his face the color of a stone that has never once been warm. Near the front, pressed against the timber rail that the constables had set to hold the crowd back, stood a woman in a gray traveling cloak, the hood drawn so far forward that her face was only a suggestion of a chin and a mouth. No one knew her. She had come into Ashcombe 2 days before on the mail coach, taken a room above the chandler's shop, and given her name to no one who asked. And when the constable raised his hand to signal the drop, this cloaked woman leaned toward the rail and said, in a voice pitched to carry no farther than the men closest to her, a single sentence about the Baron of Harrowgate that stopped the hanging cold. You will want to know what she said. So did every soul in that square. Yet a secret spoken at a gallows is a different thing from a secret written down. And to understand why 6 words could halt an execution and unmake a barony, you must first understand the man on the horse and the woman under the hood, and what the two of them had been to each other before the world decided they were nothing at all. Her name was Eleanor Vane, and once, before the gray cloak, she had worn muslin the color of new cream, and danced 2 sets in a single evening, with a young officer named Julian Rathbone. It had been the Aldous Ball, the only grand ball her father, the parson, had ever secured her an invitation to, wrangled from a wealthy parishioner who owed him a kindness, and Eleanor had gone in a gown made over twice from her late mother's, and had known perfectly well that every woman in the room could count the alterations at a glance. That officer she danced with was now the Baron of Harrowgate, though he had not been born to it, and the distance between the man he had been and the man on the horse was the distance this whole story means to cross. Eleanor had been 17 then, and the daughter of a country parson with more books than income, which in the arithmetic of the season made her a girl a man might dance with and never marry. She had understood this. She had danced anyway. She remembered the 2 sets the way one remembers a warm room in a cold year. He had been a second son with no title and a commission not yet taken up, and he had asked her the second time in defiance of his own mother, who had steered him all evening toward girls with dowries, and had watched the parson's daughter with a fan held high. Julian had not cared. He had asked Eleanor what she was reading, which no man had ever asked her at a ball, and when she told him she was halfway through a history of the peninsula that her father disapproved of, he had laughed. A real laugh, and said that he expected to see the peninsula himself before long, and would tell her whether the book had it right. She had thought of that promise for years. He never did come to tell her. By the time he saw the peninsula, the parson's daughter was a governess dismissed for theft, and the officer who laughed was a man who had forgotten how. What she had not understood that spring was that Julian would remember the 2 sets for 11 years, and that the remembering would cost them both nearly everything. He had gone to the war a second son, with no expectation of a title, and he had come back 3 years later, with a limp in his left leg that the cold still found, and an elder brother freshly dead of a fever, and a barony he had never wanted settling over his shoulders like a coat cut for a larger man. His father followed the brother into the ground within the year. And so Julian Rathbone, who had wanted only a modest commission and a modest life, became his lordship, the Baron of Harrowgate, master of 4,000 acres and 200 tenants and a great cold house called Marin Hall, in which he now lived almost entirely alone. Eleanor knew all of this, because Eleanor had made it her business to know. She had not seen him in 11 years. She had come to Ashcombe, though wearing a dead woman's cloak, carrying a secret she had guarded since she was 19. And she had come because a poacher's widow was about to hang, and because Eleanor was one of perhaps 3 people alive who knew that the wood in which the hare had been taken did not belong to the Baron of Harrowgate at all. That is the secret. Not all of it, only the seed of it. To the people of Ashcombe, the woman under the hood was nothing, A stranger, a vagrant perhaps, or a madwoman, come to gawp at a death. One of the constables, a heavy man named Pettifer, had marked her on the first day, and decided she was a beggar, working the crowd for coin, and he said so to his fellow at the rail. "There she is again. That gray one," he said. "Beggar or worse. Keep your purse close." It was the first time the label was spoken aloud, and it would not be the last, and each time it was spoken it would be wrong, in a way that mattered more. Eleanor heard it. She always heard these things. Now 11 years of being, no one had taught her to hear the small verdicts the world passed on her before it had trouble to learn her name. She did not correct the man. She drew the hood a fraction closer and kept her eyes on the horse at the square's edge and on the man who sat it, and she waited for the moment when 6 words would be worth more than her whole safe silence. Let me tell you how she came to hold them. The winter Eleanor turned 19, her father, the parson, died of the same low fever that had taken half the parish, and Eleanor found herself with a small stack of unsellable sermons, a smaller stack of unpaid bills, and no relation nearer than a cousin in Bath who did not want her. She took the only position a gentlewoman, without fortune, could take, without disgrace. She became a governess. And the household that engaged her, through an agency in London that asked few questions, was the household of a man named Silas Rathbone, the very elder brother whose death would one day make Julian a baron. She had not known the connection when she took the post. She learned it on the 3rd day, when she saw the miniature on the drawing-room mantel and recognized the officer she had danced with, painted younger and in uniform, and understood that the cold master of the house was that officer's brother. She had stood before that small painted face for longer than her duties allowed, until a housemaid coughed in the doorway, and she moved on. Julian himself was still at the war. Then Eleanor told herself the coincidence meant nothing. She taught the 2 small daughters of the house, Louisa, who was 8 and stubborn, and Kitty, who was 6 and afraid of the dark, their letters and their globes, and she kept to the schoolroom, and she did her work well, because doing her work well was the only dignity the world had left her that no one could take. The schoolroom was a narrow, cold room at the top of the house, with one window that looked out over the stable yard, and Eleanor came to love it the way a prisoner loves the one patch of sky she can see. She taught Kitty to read by candlelight when the child could not sleep, tracing the letters with a small finger over the child's, and she taught Louisa the rivers of England until the girl could name them backward, and in the small warmth of those 2 children, she found the first thing that had felt like a home since her father's death. It made what came after worse. She had known taking the post that a governess belongs nowhere and to no one. She had let herself forget it. That was her own doing, and she did not forgive herself the forgetting for a long time. Silas Rathbone was not a kind man. Eleanor learned this slowly in the way one learns the shape of a room in the dark. He was charming at dinner and cruel above the stairs. He kept accounts that did not add, and he entertained men from London who came late and left early and never gave their names. And once, in the 2nd month of her service, Eleanor came upon a document on his desk that she was not meant to see. And being a parson's daughter who could read Latin and law, she understood exactly what it was. It was a deed, or rather, it was a forgery of one. Silas had been quietly transferring the title of a certain parcel of wooded land, the wood along the Ashcombe boundary, out of the name of an old and childless neighbor and into his own, by means of a signature that the old neighbor had never made. The wood was not large, but it bordered the turnpike, and a man who could show clear title to it could sell the timber rights and the sporting rights both. And in a bad year that was the difference between a mortgaged estate and a solvent one. Eleanor should have said nothing. A governess who accuses her master of forgery is a governess in the workhouse by nightfall, or worse. She was 19, though, and her father had died believing that the truth was owed to God whether or not the world would pay for it. And so she made a copy of the false deed in her own careful hand, working 3 nights running while the house slept, matching the hand and the figures and the false signature, stroke for stroke. and she hid the copy in the lining of her traveling cloak, where no search would find it. Then she waited for a chance to give it to someone who could act on it. She had no notion who that someone might be. She only knew that a thing written down could not be entirely unmade, and that a thing carried was a thing not yet lost. The chance never came the way she imagined. Silas found the schoolroom candle burning late one night, and he came up the narrow stair himself, which he never did, and he found Eleanor at the little desk with paper before her, and the original deed she had taken down once more to check a figure. She covered the copy in time. She did not cover fast enough to hide from him that she had understood something. He said nothing that night. He was too clever a man to shout. He looked at her the way a man looks at a lock he means to change. And he went back down the stair, and in the morning he dismissed her without a character, which meant without a reference, which meant without any means of taking another respectable post anywhere in England. He told the agency she had stolen a brooch. He told the neighborhood she was dishonest and possibly worse, and he did it with the smooth regret of a man grieved to report a servant's failing, and because he was a gentleman and she was a governess, the neighborhood believed him within the hour. Louisa and Kitty were not permitted to say goodbye to her. Eleanor left by the kitchen door with a single trunk and the cloak on her back, and she stood in the road not knowing which way to walk. And that was the second time in her life the world decided who she was, without asking. She was 22. Then she kept the copy of the deed. It was all she had, and for 9 years it was very nearly all she was. You are perhaps wondering where Julian was in all of this. So was Eleanor, for years. The answer is that he was in Spain, and then in a field hospital, and then, when he finally came home to bury a brother, he had never much liked. The governess who had been dismissed for theft was a story 2 years cold, if he heard it at all. He did not connect the disgraced woman and the servant's gossip with the parson's daughter. He had danced with a lifetime before. Why would he? He had a title he did not want, and a house he could not warm, and a grief that had nothing to do with his brother, and everything to do with a war he could not stop seeing when he closed his eyes. Because Julian had his own wound, and it is time you knew its shape. In Spain in the last winter of his war, Julian had given an order. It was a small order, the kind an officer gives 100 times without a second thought. He had sent a young ensign named Kobe Hale, barely 17, a farmer's son from Kent, who had joined for the coat and the shilling, and who wrote his mother every Sunday, in a careful round hand, across an open field with a message. Because the message was urgent, and the field looked clear. Julian had looked at that field himself in the gray light, and had judged it safe. The field was not clear. There were riflemen in the far tree line that no glass had shown, and they let the boy get halfway before they fired. Julian had watched Kobe fall from 100 yards away, and had not been able to reach him for 2 hours, pinned by the same fire. And when at last he crawled to the boy, the child was dead, with the message still folded in his hand, undelivered, and as it turned out, no longer necessary. Because the situation the message described had already changed while the boy was dying for it. He had died for nothing at all. Julian had sent him. In the boy's coat, Julian had found a letter, half finished, begun that morning before the order came, addressed to a mother in Kent, and stopped mid-sentence. It said that the food was better than she feared, and that he had been made ensign, and that he hoped. That was where it stopped. He hoped. And in the years since, the Baron of Harrogate had become a man who did not give orders lightly, who checked and rechecked every field before he sent anyone across it, who read every account and every lease and every warrant twice before he set his name to it, all except his dead brother's books, which he could not bring himself to open at all, because he suspected what was in them and could not bear to find the field unclear one more time. He had built around his own heart a cold so complete that no one at Marin Hall had seen him smile in living memory. The servants thought him proud. He was not proud. He was afraid, in the specific way of a man who has learned what his own judgment costs other people. He kept the boy's unfinished letter in the breast of his coat against the skin, and he had never shown it to a living soul. This was the man Eleanor came to Ashcombe to face, a man frozen by a death he blamed himself for. A man who did not know that the wood his brother had stolen was about to hang an innocent woman in his name. For Grace, the poacher's widow, had been arrested for taking a hare from Harrogate Wood, and the warrant named the Baron as the injured party, the owner of the land, the man whose property had been violated. And Eleanor, alone in her room above the chandler's shop holding the copied deed she had carried for 9 years, understood a thing that turned her blood to still water. The Baron did not own that wood. His brother had forged the title to it, which meant Grace was to be hanged for poaching on land the Baron had no lawful claim to, in a case the Baron himself did not know was built on his dead brother's crime. And Eleanor was the only person left alive who could prove it. She could have taken the deed to the magistrate. She had thought of little else on the coach from London. A magistrate presented with a copied document by a woman of no character and no name would only burn the paper and jail the woman, and Grace would hang regardless, and the forgery would sink back into the dark where it had lain for a decade. There was only one man in Ashcombe with the standing to stop a hanging on his own authority and the power to make an accusation of forgery stick. It was the Baron. It had to be the Baron. She would have to make Julian believe her, in public, with a rope already around a woman's neck, and she would have to do it in 6 words or fewer, because that was all the time the drop would give her. So she stood at the rail in her grey cloak, and when Pettifer the constable raised his hand, Eleanor leaned forward and said the 6 words she had come 3 days and 11 years to say. She said, clear enough for the Baron alone to hear across the sudden hush, "Your brother forged the Ashcombe deed." For a moment, nothing happened. The constable's hand hung in the air. The crowd, sensing a hitch without knowing its cause, went still the way a field goes still before weather. And the Baron of Harrogate, who had been staring at the middle distance the way he stared at everything, now turned his head very slowly toward the grey cloak at the rail, and something moved behind his cold face that no one at Marenhall had seen in years. It was not recognition. Not yet. It was the particular stillness of a man who has just heard spoken aloud in a market square, a fact he had felt in his bones for years, without ever letting himself name it. He raised one gloved hand. The constable lowered his own. The drop did not come. "Bring that woman to me," the Baron said, and his voice was level and carried, and the crowd parted around Eleanor as if she had caught fire. They took her to the George, the coaching inn on the square, and put her in a private parlor with a low fire, and the Baron came in alone and shut the door. And for the first time in 11 years, Eleanor stood in a room with Julian and let the hood fall back from her face. He knew her. She watched him know her. It came over him the way dawn comes over a cold field, slow, and then all at once, and the level Baron's mask did not so much crack as forget itself for the space of a breath. "Miss Vane," he said. Then, because 11 years is 11 years and both of them had learned what the world did to feeling left in the open, he set the mask back in place. And he said more quietly, "You danced 2 sets. In the Aldous ballroom. You wore cream." "I did," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of the cloak, were not entirely steady. "You remember a ballroom, my lord. I have come to speak to you of a wood." "Tell me," he said, and she told him. All of it in the order it had happened, without softening her own disgrace or sparing his brother's memory. The forged deed, the dismissal, the copy she had carried for 9 years hidden in the lining of the very cloak she wore, because she had never dared put it anywhere a man like Silas might reach. She laid it on the table between them, the ink faded, but the false signature plain, and the true owner's name, an old man named Corbin, who had died without heirs and whose land had simply been absorbed into the Harrogate accounts as if it had always been there. The Baron read it once. He read it twice. He carried it to the window and held it to the grey light and studied the false signature against the true owner's name. And Eleanor watched his gloved thumb move once across the paper as though he might rub the crime away. And Eleanor, watching his face, saw a thing she had not expected to see. She had expected anger, or denial, or the cold refusal of a great man who would not be told his fortune was built on a crime. She saw instead something almost like relief, terrible and quiet, the look of a man who has carried a weight so long that even confirmation of its worst shape comes as a kind of ease. His shoulders, which she had watched hold their soldier's line all through the square, came down by a fraction as though a rope had been loosed from him as well. I always knew, he said very low, that my brother's books did not add. I told myself I did not have the time to understand them. He set the deed down. That was a lie. I did not have the courage. He looked at her, and for once, the cold went entirely out of his face. A woman is on my gallows for a hair taken from a wood that is not mine. And you have known this for 9 years, and you came. I came, she said. Why now? He asked. Why not 9 years ago? To a magistrate. Because 9 years ago I was a governess dismissed for theft, she said. And no magistrate in England would have taken my word over your brother's grave. She lifted her chin. And because until 3 days ago I did not know a woman was to hang for it. I could carry my own ruin, my lord. I found I could not carry hers. Something passed between them in that low-ceilinged parlor that neither of them named. The fire settled. Outside, the crowd had not dispersed, because a hanging stopped is a stranger thing than a hanging finished, and word was already moving through Ashcombe that the grey woman had whispered something to the Baron that no one could hear. If I do this, the Baron said at last, if I stand in that square, and say the wood was never mine, I unmake a good part of my own estate, the timber rights, the boundary, 9 years of accounts that will all have to be opened to the assizes. I make myself a fool at best and a party to forgery at worst, and there will be men in London glad to call it the worst. He said it not as a complaint, but as a plain reckoning of the field before he sent anyone across it, the way he reckoned everything now. And I must do it in front of the whole village, who will not forget it, and who will look at my sons if I have any, and remember the day the Baron confessed his house to a crime on a gallows step. You must, said Eleanor. I know, said the Baron. He was quiet a moment. There was a boy once, he said, and stopped, and Eleanor did not press him, and he did not go on. But she understood that he had told her something all the same, in the space where the sentence broke. There is a thing I have learned, he said instead, at a cost I will not name to you tonight. A field that looks clear is not always clear. A rope around a woman's neck, though, is a thing I can see plainly. I will not let it fall, because I was afraid to open a book. He crossed to the door, and then he stopped, and he turned back, and he did a thing that undid the last 9 years of her careful invisibility. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her across the Aldous ballroom, when they were young and the world had not yet decided what they were worth. Come with me, he said, not because I command it, because they will believe a thing spoken by the two of us, that they will not believe from either alone. She should have said no. A woman of no character standing beside a baron in a public square was a woman inviting a second ruin on top of her first. Eleanor had spent 11 years choosing safety, however, and had bought with it only a gray cloak and a hired room, and so she found, to her own surprise, that she wanted very much to stand in the light beside him, whatever it cost. She went with him. What happened in the square was talked of in Ashcombe for a generation. The Baron of Harrogate walked out of the George with the grey woman at his side, and the crowd fell back, and then fell silent, and he crossed the cobbles to the foot of the gallows in the level, unhurried stride of a man walking into his own drawing-room. He mounted the steps of the gallows itself, where Grace Follett stood white and swaying with the rope still loose about her neck, her lips moving on a prayer that had no more words left in it, and he loosed the rope with his own gloved hands gently, the way one lifts a thing from a child. Then he turned to the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He told them in the level tone that carried to the last man at the back of the square that the wood along the Ashcombe boundary had never lawfully belonged to Harrogate, that his late brother had taken it from old Corbin by a forged hand, while Corbin lived alone and childless and unable to defend it, and that, No man or woman could be lawfully hanged, for poaching on land the Rathbones had no right to hold. There was no rope tonight, he said, and there would be none, and the case was withdrawn, and the shame of it was his to carry and not this woman's. A murmur went through the square like wind through standing corn, and somewhere near the back a woman began to weep, and the constable Pettifer's raised warrant hung forgotten in his hand. The magistrate blustered. The constable Pettifer, who had called Eleanor a beggar at that very rail, opened his mouth to protest that the warrant was lawful. And it was the third time the label was spoken, for he pointed at Eleanor beside the baron and said, "And you would take the word of this vagrant over the king's warrant." Yet the word died in the square, because the Baron of Harrogate turned his cold face upon the man, and because the crowd had already understood, in the way crowds do, that the Grey Woman had been right, and the warrant wrong, and that they had come to see the wrong death entirely. The Baron did not humiliate the magistrate. He did not need to. He simply produced the copied deed, and named the man Corbin, and said that a full account would go to the assizes at his own expense and under his own name, and that any man who wished to dispute the matter might dispute it there. Then he offered Grace his arm down the gallows steps as though she were a duchess, and the crowd which had come for a death gave instead the low murmur of a village watching justice arrive 11 years, and one forged signature too late. Here, if this were a simpler story, it would end. The innocent woman freed the secret, spoken. The cold man thawed. Yet Eleanor knew what the world did to women who stood in the light beside great men, and she was right to know it, because the reckoning was not yet finished. There was a dowager at Marin Hall. The Baron's aunt, a Lady Sefton, who had run the great house through the years of Julian's grief, and had come to think of its fortune as a thing she guarded on behalf of a nephew too broken to guard it himself. Lady Sefton had not been in the square. Ward reached her at the hall within the hour, however borne by a footman, that the Baron had stood on a public gallows and confessed the family to forgery on the say-so of a strange woman in a grey cloak, and Lady Sefton put on her darkest silk, and ordered the carriage and came down into Ashcombe to undo what she could. She found them at the George, the Baron, and Eleanor and the freed woman Grace. And she swept into the parlor with the particular certainty of a woman who had never once in her life been the wrong person in her room. She did not look at Eleanor. That was the whole of her strategy. She spoke to her nephew as though the governess were furniture, and she said that the estate could not survive such a confession, that the assizes would strip them of the boundary and the timber both, that a barony was a trust held for the sons who would come after, and not a thing to be thrown into a market square for the sake of a poacher and a woman of no name. "And who," she said at last, permitting herself one cool glance at the grey cloak, "is this creature you have chosen to ruin us for?" It was, in its way, the fourth voicing of the same verdict Pettifer had spoken at the rail, and it was the cruelest, because it came from a woman who had the power to make it stick. Eleanor did not answer. It was not her place to answer, and she had learned long ago the cost of speaking in rooms like this one. The Baron of Harrogate, though, who had spent 9 years letting his aunt run his house because it was easier than feeling anything, set down the glass in his hand, and he said, in the level voice that had loosed a rope an hour before, "This is Miss Eleanor Vane. She is the daughter of a clergyman, and she carried the truth of Corbin's Wood for 9 years at the cost of her own name, when I had not the courage to open my brother's books." He looked at his aunt without cruelty and without retreat. "You ask who she is. She is the only person in 11 years who has told me the truth to my face. I will not have her called a creature in my hearing." Lady Sefton went very still. She was not a stupid woman. She heard under her nephew's level words, a thing she had not heard in him since before the war. She heard that the cold had gone out of him, and a hierarchy protector, faced with the collapse of the very coldness she had built her authority upon, does the arithmetic quickly. She saw that she had lost the room. She did not weep or rage. She gathered her darkest silk about her, and she said, only in a voice from which the certainty had drained, that she hoped he knew what he was doing, and that she would be at the hall when he chose to come home. Then she went out to her carriage, corrected rather than destroyed, displaced rather than punished, and the parlor was quiet behind her. Grace went home that night to a cottage that was empty of the child she had poached to feed, and the Baron settled a small annuity on her that no account book would ever fully explain, and that is the last we shall say of her, except that she lived, and that she had not, and that the difference was a woman in a gray cloak who had refused to carry someone else's death. As for Eleanor and the Baron, the thing between them did not resolve that night, because 11 years does not resolve in an evening, and because both of them had been taught by hard tutors to distrust anything that arrived looking like happiness. He asked her, though, before she climbed the Chandler's stairs to her hired room, whether she would do him the honor of dining at Marin Hall the following week, chaperoned by the housekeeper and above all reproach, so that he might begin to understand the 11 years he had missed. Luck. And Eleanor, who had spent those years believing that no one would ever again ask her anything but to be invisible, found that her voice, when it came, was steadier than her hands. "I should like that," she said. The dinner became a second dinner, and the second a habit, and the habit a courtship conducted so slowly and so properly that all of Ashcombe had time to revise its opinion of the Grey Woman twice over before the banns were read. The assizes took the Boundary Wood, as Lady Sefton had feared, and returned it to the Corbin estate to be sold for the benefit of the parish poor. And Harrogate was the smaller for it, and the Baron did not once regret the loss, because a man who has hanged a boy in Spain does not mourn the loss of stolen acres. He mourned other things. He was learning, slowly, to stop. On a bright, cold morning the following spring, in the small parish church at Ashcombe where Eleanor's own father might have preached had the fever spared him, Eleanor married the Baron of Harrogate. She did not wear cream. She wore a gown of soft gray, chosen on purpose because the gray cloak had carried her through the worst of her life, and she would not be ashamed of it, and because Julian had told her, in the low voice he now used only with her, that he had thought her the bravest person in England, the moment the hood fell back in the George. They lived at Marin Hall, which was cold no longer. The servants, who had not seen the master smile in living memory, saw it now, first as a rare thing and then as a common one, and an old housekeeper named Mrs. Dunmore, who had run the schoolrooms of 2 generations, took the new Lady Harrogate aside within the month to say that the hall had wanted a mistress for longer than her ladyship could know, and that it was glad of one at last. Eleanor found the miniature of the young officer still on the drawing-room mantel, moved from the dead brother's house years before, along with the rest of Silas's effects, and she left it where it stood, because the boy in the painting had become the man beside her, and she wanted the whole of him, the war and the wound and all. She wrote, that first spring, a careful letter to a farmhouse in Kent, to a mother who had waited years to know how her son had died. And she told the woman the truth, that Kobe Hale had died carrying a message and hoping, and she enclosed no more than that, and it was the hardest letter she ever wrote, and the one she was gladdest to have sent. And in the breast of his coat, Julian still carried the boy's unfinished letter, but he had shown it to her now. One evening by the fire, spread flat under both their hands, and a thing shared is a thing halved, and he found after that he could sometimes close his eyes without seeing the open field. On the last evening of that first married winter, snow came down over the Marin Valley, thick and soundless, and Eleanor stood at the tall window of the drawing-room and watched it fill the dark. Behind her the fire cracked in the grate. On the table lay the copied deed, folded now, and kept, not as a weapon but as a record, the paper that had halted a hanging and unmade a barony and carried a woman out of 11 years of gray. Julian came and stood beside her at the glass, and he did not command her to come away from the cold window, and he did not need to, because she was already exactly where she wished to be. "You whispered 6 words at a gallows," he said, watching the snow with her. "You might have kept them, and kept yourself safe." "I might," she said. "I am glad," said the Baron of Harrogate, "that you have never once in your life chosen the safe thing." And he took her hand at the cold glass, and outside the snow came down over the wood that was no longer theirs, and over the parish it now fed, and over the small square where a rope had not fallen. If Eleanor's long silence and the 6 words that ended it moved you, stay a moment in the quiet with them before you go. The fire settled, the snow did not stop, and the gray cloak hung on its peg by the door, its lining empty at last, keeping nothing now but the shape of the woman who had worn it out of the dark.